Night, my daughter set her coffee mug down twice on the saucer and then once on the table. I almost didn't register it. I was mid-sentence, asking Philip about his drive up from Hamilton, half distracted by the snow coming down heavier than the forecast had promised, when I heard it. 2 soft clicks of ceramic on ceramic, then 1 deliberate tap on the wooden table. I looked across at her. She was laughing at something Philip had just said. Her chin tilted the way her mother used to tilt hers when she found something genuinely funny. Her hands were resting easy on either side of the saucer. Nothing out of place at all. But I taught her that pattern when she was 11 years old, and certain things don't leave you. Let me go back. My name is Ian Macleod. I'm 57. I spent 29 years as a forensic auditor with the Canada Revenue Agency in Ottawa. The kind of career that makes people's eyes glaze over at barbecues until you mention the cases. Tax fraud, offshore shelters, number companies layered 3 and 4 deep to hide money that was never supposed to see the light of an honest return. I was good at it, not because I was brilliant, but because I was patient. And in that line of work, patience matters more than brilliance almost every time. I retired 2 years ago. Voluntary, technically. Though I think my body had been filing its own retirement papers for a while. My knees mostly, and a tiredness that settled into me after Ruth died that I couldn't seem to shake with any amount of sleep. Ruth passed 3 years ago this February. Pancreatic cancer. From the first scan to the last morning was 9 weeks. I've never fully accepted how fast it happened, and I suspect I never will. We had 31 years together. She was a library technician at the Ottawa Public Library, Rosemount branch, and she could recommend the right book to anyone, any mood, any age, within 2 minutes of conversation. That was her gift. She listened the way most people only pretend to. Our daughter, Jenna, is 32. She works as an occupational therapist at a rehabilitation center in Kanata. She has Ruth's voice, that particular warmth in it that makes you feel like whatever you just said was worth hearing. And my stubbornness, which has been both an asset and a problem depending on the year. She was engaged once at 26 to a man named Scott who turned out to have a second relationship running simultaneously in Montreal. She found out 3 weeks before the wedding when a woman she'd never met sent her a Facebook message with photographs. That broke something in Jenna, not visibly. She went back to work the following Monday, returned the dress, canceled the haul. But I watched her build a wall after that, brick by careful brick, and for nearly 6 years no one got close enough to even see the wall, let alone get past it. So when she called me on a Tuesday evening in late September and told me she'd been seeing someone she wanted to bring to Thanksgiving dinner, I sat down in the kitchen chair and listened more carefully than I'd listened to anything in months. His name is Philip Dre, she said. He's 44. He runs his own wealth management practice, mostly serving clients in the Hamilton-Burlington area. I wrote the name on the back of an envelope. Old habit from the CRA days. If it matters, write it down. You sound happy, I said. I am, Dad. She paused. I really am. We have a tradition, Jenna and I. Every Thanksgiving since Ruth passed, I make her mother's tourtière from the recipe card Ruth kept in the wooden box above the stove, the one with her handwriting that got smaller and more precise over the years as she refined the spice ratios. I set the table with Ruth's good plates, the ones we bought together on a trip to Quebec City in 2004. And Jenna brings the wine and the salad, and we eat too much and watch whatever old film is on CBC that evening. It's not fancy, it's ours. This year there would be a third plate. I spent the 2 weeks before Thanksgiving doing what any retired forensic auditor would do when his daughter introduces a new man. I looked into Philip Dre. On the surface, nothing raised a flag. He had a registered practice with the Ontario Securities Commission. His website was clean, professional, not overdone. A few client testimonials that read as genuine. He'd worked at a mid-size advisory firm in Toronto for 8 years before striking out on his own about 5 years back. His CRM profile listed appropriate certifications. Everything checked out, but there were textures that caught my attention. His social media presence was thin in a way that felt curated rather than neglected. He had connections, but almost no history of public interaction. His business was registered to a shared office address on King Street in Hamilton. Perfectly legitimate, common for independent advisors. But the kind of detail I'd learned to note rather than dismiss. And when I ran his name through the usual channels, looking for complaints, disputes, regulatory actions, I found nothing at all. Most people would find that reassuring. In my experience, a completely clean record in financial services can mean one of two things. Either the person is genuinely upstanding, or they've been very deliberate about keeping certain things from surfacing. I didn't mention any of this to Gina. I had nothing concrete, and I'd learned a hard lesson after the situation with Scott. I'd seen the warning signs early that time too, but I'd come at Jenna too directly too soon before she was ready to hear it. We barely spoke for 4 months afterward. I wasn't going to make that mistake again. I ironed a shirt for Thanksgiving dinner. Ruth would have laughed at that too. She always said I only ironed when I was nervous. Philip arrived at the house 11 minutes early. I noticed because I'd been watching the street from the living room window, not anxiously, just out of habit. 11 minutes early to a first meeting with a girlfriend's father is a specific choice. That means you want to set the room before anyone else arrives. He was tall, well-dressed in a way that seemed effortless but wasn't. Good coat, not flashy. A firm handshake that lasted exactly the right amount of time. He brought a bottle of Trius Red, a solid Niagara wine. Not too expensive, not too cheap. He stepped inside and noticed the photograph of Ruth on the shelf by the coat hooks. "Jenna's told me about her," he said quietly. "I can see where she gets her smile. It was perfectly calibrated. The right words at the right volume, at the right moment." I watched Jenna watching him say it, and her face opened the way. A window opens on the first warm day after a long winter. We sat down to dinner. The tourtière came out well, a little heavy on the clove, but close to Ruth's version. Philip asked about my career, listened attentively, asked follow-up questions that showed he'd done his homework on what forensic auditing actually entails. He talked about his own work in a way that was engaging without being technical. He clearly understood that I understood finance, and he calibrated accordingly. He was good. I want to be clear about that. He was very, very good. We were halfway through the meal. The salad plates cleared, the tourtière mostly gone, when the conversation shifted to Jenna's work. A new policy at the rehabilitation center was frustrating her. Something about documentation requirements that were eating into actual patient time. Philip listened with visible empathy, reached over and briefly touched her wrist. That's when I heard it. 2 taps of her coffee mug on the saucer, then 1 on the table. Quick and quiet, almost lost under the conversation. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. I set it down slowly. Here's the thing about a signal like that. It only works if both people remember it, and if it was real enough in the first place to survive the years. I created ours when Jenna was in grade 6. There was a hockey coach at a school, a man everyone trusted, who started saying things to some of the girls that didn't cross an obvious line but made Jenna uncomfortable in a way she couldn't explain to other adults. She told me one evening while I was driving her home from practice. She said it in a rush, like she was afraid if she slowed down she'd stop. I told her this. If you're ever in a situation where something feels wrong but you can't say it out loud, use the signal. 2 taps on something nearby, then 1. 2, 1. Like a heartbeat. I'll know. You won't have to explain. I'll handle the rest. Ruth came up with the pattern. She said 3 taps was too common. People tap things all the time in 3s. But 2 then 1 was unusual enough that it wouldn't happen by accident. Jenna never had to use it with the coach. I handled that situation through other channels, but we kept the signal. It became one of those private things between a father and a daughter that you don't talk about but never quite forget. She remembered. I looked at her across the table. She was still smiling at Philip, still engaged in the conversation, but there was a set to her jaw that I recognized instantly. The exact expression Ruth used to get when she was holding something difficult inside and waiting for the right moment. I picked up my wine glass, took a slow sip, set it down. "Philip," I said, "tell me more about your client base. Jenna mentioned you mostly work with individual investors." He smiled. "That's right. I find the institutional side too impersonal. I got into this work because I wanted to help real people with real goals. Retirement planning, education savings, that sort of thing." "Makes sense," I said. "What kind of returns have your clients been seeing lately given the market?" And we were off. He described a proprietary investment approach, diversified across sectors with what he called strategic positioning in undervalued Canadian equities and select international funds. He name-dropped a few firms, used the right terminology. Everything he said was plausible. Everything he said was also impossible to verify across a dinner table with Hussera crumbs on it. I smiled and nodded and filed every word. After dessert, Ruth's butter tarts that I've learned to make almost as well as she did. Jenna went to the kitchen to put the coffee on. Philip and I were alone for the first time. "She's remarkable," he said, looking toward the kitchen. "You did a hell of a job raising her." "Her mother did the heavy lifting," I said. He nodded sympathetically. Then, in a tone that was warm and almost casual, he said, "I hope this isn't too forward. But Jenna mentioned you have some retirement savings sitting in a traditional RRSP from your CRA days. I know it's early to be having this kind of conversation, but I'd love to sit down sometime and walk you through some options that might give you better growth, especially with the TFSA contribution room you're probably not fully using." There it was. The RRSP. The TFSA. Specific enough to show he'd been briefed, casual enough to seem like friendly conversation. I'd sat across from this exact moment hundreds of times in my career. The setup always feels like generosity. It never is. "I'm pretty conservative with that money," I said. "Old habits." "Absolutely," he said immediately. "No pressure at all. Just an open door whenever you're comfortable." Jenna came back with the coffee. The evening moved on. Philip was charming for the rest of it, attentive, self-deprecating at the right moments. When he left, he shook my hand and said he looked forward to the next time. I stood on the porch and watched his car disappear down the street into the November dark. The snow still falling in that quiet, relentless Ottawa way. Then I went inside and called Constance Beach. Constance spent 26 years with FineTrack before moving to a private forensic consulting practice in Toronto. She is, without exaggeration, one of the most methodical investigators I've ever worked with. And during a complex offshore case in 2017, I provided testimony that kept her firm's analysis from being thrown out on a procedural challenge. She has never forgotten it and has told me as much exactly once, which from Constance is the equivalent of a blood oath. I called her at 9:15 that evening. "I need you to pull everything you can on a name," I said. "Philip Dre. Independent financial advisor, Hamilton area. OSC registered." She was quiet for a moment. "How deep?" "Deep enough to find what's not on the surface." She called me back 41 hours later. I was in the basement, sanding the legs of a rocking chair I'd been restoring since the summer. "Something to do with my hands while my mind worked." "Ian," Constance said, "where did your daughter meet this man?" "The air left my lungs. Tell me." Philip Dre's full legal name until 5 years ago was Philip Dreyford. He'd shortened it when he left his firm and went independent. Constance had found 2 formal complaints filed with the Ontario Securities Commission, both from women in their 50s and 60s, both widowed, both describing a pattern so similar it read like a template, a relationship that developed slowly and warmly over months, a gradual, gentle introduction to investment opportunities. Funds that ended up routed through numbered companies to accounts that became very difficult to trace once you started looking. Both complaints had been settled. The terms were sealed. There was a third situation. Not a formal complaint, but a civil action filed in Alberta by a 63-year-old retired nurse. That case had been dropped when the woman's family convinced her to settle privately rather than endure the stress of litigation. The settlement amount was never disclosed. In each case, the woman had been introduced to Philip through someone in her existing social circle, a friend, a colleague, someone who had already been cultivated by Philip and folded into his network of credibility. The introductions always felt organic. They never were. I sat down on the basement floor, my back against the workbench, the phone pressed to my ear. "How exposed is Jenna?" I asked. "That depends," Constance said carefully. "Has he asked her for money directly?" "Not yet. But he brought up your RRSP." "Yes, and my TFSA. Ian." Her voice was steady and precise, the way it always was when she was about to say something that would hurt. "He's not targeting your daughter's money. She's the vehicle. You're the objective. A retired CRA forensic auditor with a full government pension and decades of retirement savings. That's a significant portfolio for someone like him." I thought about the 11 minutes early. The trias read at exactly the right price point. The comment about Ruth's photograph, the way he'd listened to me all evening and adjusted his register in real time, matching my vocabulary, mirroring my body language. He had been charming. He'd been performing. I need to talk to Jenna, I said. You need to be strategic about how, Constance said. If she's emotionally invested and you go in with accusations before you have something undeniable, you'll lose her. I've seen it happen in every romance fraud case I've ever consulted on. The target defends the predator. The family member becomes the enemy, and the isolation completes itself without the con artist lifting a finger. I knew she was right. I'd seen the same pattern from the other side of the desk more times than I could count during my years at the CRA, watching spouses and children defend the very people who were defrauding them, not out of stupidity, but out of love and the terrible vulnerability that love creates. Give me a few days, I said. I want to say something here about romance fraud that most people don't understand, and it's the part where I used to lose people in conversation. The part where they'd lean back and say, but why didn't she just walk away? Philip had been in Jenna's life for 5 months. 5 months of dinners at restaurants along the Hamilton waterfront and weekend drives through Niagara wine country and late-night phone calls that lasted hours. 5 months of being the person who showed up after a difficult shift at the rehab center, who remembered the name of the patient she'd been worried about, who texted her every morning with something small and specific that proved he'd been listening. 5 months of being the first man since Scott made her believe she was worth the effort of real attention. That's not an accident. That's engineering. Every act of warmth was a load-bearing wall and a structure designed to make her feel that questioning him meant questioning her own judgment, her own capacity to be loved. The signal told me she already sensed something was wrong, but sensing something is wrong and being willing to demolish 5 months of carefully constructed hope are two very different things. I needed to give her something she couldn't argue with. So I set a trap. I called Jenna the following morning and told her I'd been thinking about what Philip mentioned at dinner, about my RRSP in the TFSA room. I said I was open to hearing more. I asked if she could arrange a sit-down, the three of us, at my house the following Saturday. She paused. Really? You've always been so set on keeping everything where it is. I'm 57, I said. Maybe your old man's finally ready to stop being so stubborn about money. She laughed, and it was a real laugh. The kind that comes from relief and hope and the belief that things might actually be working out. That laugh cost me something I can't fully describe. The meeting was set for Saturday at 2. I spent the week preparing. I contacted a man named Hugh Fenton, a former RCMP financial crimes investigator who'd retired to private consulting work in Ottawa, and asked him to be available on Saturday afternoon. I placed a call to my bank and had them put a temporary security hold on all account activity as a precaution. I asked Constance to prepare a printed summary of her findings, not for Jenna, not yet, but for the moment I'd need it. And I called Jenna on Thursday evening. Not about Philip, just to talk about her patients, about a podcast she'd been listening to, about whether we should try making Ruth's shortbread for Christmas this year, even though neither of us had her instinct for when the dough was right. She sounded happy, genuinely, deeply happy. I said the right things and laughed at the right moments, and when I hung up, I sat in the chair by the window where Ruth used to read in the evenings, the lamp she'd picked out at a shop and the glebe casting the same circle of light on the same patch of carpet, and I sat there for a long time. I thought about how Jenna had tapped that mug twice on the saucer and once on the table, how she'd known something was wrong before she could name it, how that signal had traveled across 21 years and landed exactly where it needed to, clean and precise like a key in a lock that hadn't been turned in decades. Saturday came. Philip arrived 9 minutes early this time, again with wine, a different Niagara label, and sat at my kitchen table with a laptop and a printed booklet for something called the Dre Strategic Growth Portfolio. He was organized and professional. He walked me through projected returns, asset allocation, risk management strategies. He had charts. He had comparisons with standard index fund performance. He had an answer for every question I asked, and each answer was smooth and detailed and exactly plausible enough. But I'd spent 29 years asking questions that were designed to sound like curiosity while functioning as traps. This third-party custodian you've got listed here, I said, tapping a line in the booklet. Walk me through the fund custody structure. How are client assets held? He explained it fluently. I asked him to write down the custodian's name and registration number. He did it without hesitation, which told me he'd prepared for this question, and that whatever he wrote down would survive a surface-level check. And the underlying funds, I said, these are all registered with the OSC? Absolutely, he said. I can pull the registration documentation for you this week. That would be great. I paused. Actually, a former colleague of mine might be able to access those faster through her channels. She spent over 25 years with Findrak, real detail person. Would you mind if I had her take a look before I commit to anything? The room shifted. It was subtle. Philip was too practiced for it to be obvious. But I felt it the way you feel the barometric pressure drop before a storm. Something behind his eyes recalibrated. Of course, he said. I'd welcome the scrutiny. Transparency is everything in this business. Great, I said. Her name is Constance Beach. She runs a forensic consulting practice in Toronto now. Does a lot of work with the OSC investigations branch. I think she actually handled some advisory cases in the Hamilton area a few years back, right around the time you went independent, actually. Small world. I let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to. Philip looked at me. I looked back. Jenna was watching both of us from across the table. The quiet lasted 5 seconds. I counted them the way I used to count seconds in interview rooms at the CRA, where silence is the most effective tool you have. Then Philip began to close his laptop. He did it calmly. He said he thought it might be better to schedule a follow-up once he had all the supporting documentation assembled properly, that he wanted to make sure everything was thorough and above board. He shook my hand. He kissed Jenna on the cheek. He gathered his booklet and his wine and walked to the door. When I opened it, Hugh Fenton was standing on the porch. Hugh introduced himself. He was calm, professional, and very specific. He explained that he'd been retained to provide information relevant to an inquiry that the Ontario Securities Commission had recently reopened, based on new documentation submitted that week, and that it would be in Philip's best interest to make himself available for a formal interview in the near future. Philip stood in my doorway for a moment. The snow was falling behind him, the kind of heavy, wet November snow that Ottawa gets when the season is making up its mind. He didn't say a word. Then he walked to his car, got in, and drove away at exactly the speed limit, like a man who understood that anything sudden would cost him more than composure was worth. I closed the door. Jenna was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had Philip's printed booklet in her hand, the Dre Strategic Growth Portfolio, and she was looking at it the way you look at something familiar that has suddenly become unrecognizable. Dad. Her voice was very even. How long have you known? I suspected at Thanksgiving dinner, I said. I had confirmation by Wednesday. She set the booklet down on the hall table next to Ruth's photograph. She placed it carefully, the way you set down something that might break what's underneath. Then she pressed both hands against her face and stood there. I didn't move toward her. I didn't say anything. 29 years of interviews taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is let someone arrive at their own understanding without rushing them. She lowered her hands after a moment and looked at me. She had Ruth's exact expression, the one Ruth would get when she was finished with something and ready to deal with whatever came next. That particular set of the mouth, that clarity in the eyes. How bad is it, she said. The other women. I told her, not everything at once, but enough. The 2 complaints, the sealed settlements. The woman in Alberta whose family had convinced her to drop the case because the stress was damaging her health. I told her what Constance had found about the numbered companies, the layered fund structures, the pattern that repeated itself with mechanical precision across years and provinces. She listened without interrupting. That's something Jenna learned to do in a very hard year when she was 26, and it's served her well since. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. The woman in Alberta, she said finally. She never saw any accountability? No. Then I want this to go all the way, Jenna said. I want to give a formal statement. I want everything I know on record, every email, every text, every conversation I can remember. All of it. I wasn't surprised, but I was proud. The kind of pride that has nothing to do with yourself, that belongs entirely to the other person and to whoever raised them before you took the credit. We spent the rest of the afternoon at the kitchen table. I made coffee the way Ruth used to, strong, with real cream, because some things should be done properly when the day calls for it. Jenna pulled up her email history with Philip on her phone, and we went through it together, message by message, flagging anything that might matter. There were moments that were hard for her. I could see it, messages where his warmth had been so convincing that even now, knowing what she knew, some part of her wanted to believe it had been real. At one point, she stopped scrolling and put her hand over mine on the table. I'm glad you heard the signal, she said. Your mother designed it, I told her. She was quiet for a moment. I'd forgotten that part. That it was her idea. Most of the good ideas were. The Ontario Securities Commission formally expanded its investigation into Philip Dreyford within 3 weeks. Constance's documentation was submitted through proper channels, and both original complainants agreed to participate in the reopened inquiry. The Alberta woman's daughter, when she was contacted by the investigator, said her mother had spent the last years of her life believing nothing would ever come of it, and that she was grateful to learn otherwise. Her mother had passed the previous spring. Jenna found out later through the investigation that Philip had moved approximately $640,000 from his various targets over a 7-year period. $640,000 in savings, in retirement funds, and money that widowed women had set aside for their remaining years. The number sat in my chest like a stone when I heard it. I don't know the full status of the case as I write this. These processes are slow, especially through the OSC, and the RCMP's involvement added another layer of procedural complexity. But they move. That's the thing about institutional accountability in this country. It's not fast, but it doesn't stop once it starts. Jenna took a week off in early December. She came over most evenings. We watched old Hitchcock films on the CBC reruns, worked on the rocking chair together, drove out to Gatineau Park one cold afternoon and walked the trail along Pink Lake without saying much. The kind of silence between two people that doesn't need filling. She didn't talk about Philip often. There wasn't much left to say about him. But one evening, near the end of that week, she helped me hang a small framed watercolor in the hallway. She'd found it at an antique shop in El Monte, a painting of wildflowers that she said reminded her of the ones Ruth used to grow in the backyard every summer. We stepped back and looked at it hanging next to Ruth's photograph. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always. When you were working cases of the CRA, all those years of investigating people, did you ever have a strong feeling about someone and turn out to be wrong?" I thought about it honestly. "Yes," I said, "more than once. That's why you build the case. A feeling isn't proof. You have to find what's underneath the feeling and see whether it holds." She nodded slowly, looking at the photograph and the watercolor side by side. "The signal was the feeling," she said, "and everything you did after it was the proof." I looked at her. "I'm going to create something like it for my patients," she said. "A way for them to tell me something's wrong when they can't put it into words. Some of them can't speak easily. Some of them are in pain and don't want to seem difficult. They need a signal." She said it a little defensively, as though she expected me to tell her it was impractical. "I think that's exactly right," I said. She left around 9. I stood on the porch and listened to her car until the sound dissolved into the quiet of the street, the snow muffling everything the way Ottawa snow does, turning the whole city into something hushed and close. Then I went inside and turned off the lights, room by room, the way I do every evening. In the hallway I stopped. Ruth's photograph and the wildflower watercolor hung side by side, two small, bright things in the dark hall. I reached out and tapped the wall twice with my knuckles, then once. 2-1. Like a heartbeat. Then I went to bed.